on crookedness. I'm here not talking about crooks, though that may have a derivation from the same idea, i.e. criminals. I'm talking to things which are not even and not straight and bent and asymmetrical. And it's a subject that has increasingly interested me, perhaps particularly prompted from the time that I started to go to Japan in 1990, when I was about 40. And at that time, 50, and at that time I encountered Japanese art, and I discovered that one of the central aesthetic principles of Japanese art is crookedness. Another is shadows, that things shouldn't be in the blaring full light. But the crookedness is manifest in many features. To take two examples, one is tea bowls. The most highly prized and beautiful tea bowls to the Japanese are often to Western eyes extremely irregular, lumpy, almost grotesque sometimes, just a mess, it would seem, lots of holes and things sticking out and all the rest of it. And yet it just sends some Japanese into ecstasies. A really smooth and finished tea bowl is much less interesting and exciting. And another aspect of it is in the architecture. I have a tea house in my garden based on the drawings of a great expert on Japanese architecture, Edward Morse. And in the illustrations of his book and in our tea house, we have many crooked features. One in particular is a piece of wood which has been cut, and it's obviously the original was something that was bent. It curves back and forth, and so it's not a straight piece of wood. And this is there in the tea house and his illustrations, and it's much more interesting to look at. If it was just a straight piece of wood, your eye would go straight past it. But you see it and you notice and you wonder, why this? The principle in that case and in bits of crooked timber elsewhere in the tea house, railway sleepers and so on, is that the tea house is based on a homemade, self-made meditation hut high in the Japanese mountains from the 13th or 14th century, when Zen and other Chinese sects of Buddhism came into Japan. And so they just cut down a few branches and made a little hut, and it was very crooked. But this crooked aesthetic has continued, and the Japanese, I began to think, were very different from the Chinese, who were much more regular. I then came across the same contrast between the north and south of Europe. In The Stones of Venice by Ruskin, he talks about this Gothic art and architecture as shown in many medieval British cathedrals and buildings like my own college, King's College Chapel, is filled with irregularities, tensions which are not resolved, unfinished things, ad hoc. In fact, the whole of the college of King's College is crooked in a sense that there are buildings put together from different periods with entirely different art styles, medieval, 18th century, 19th century. And so it's not symmetrical. And that is a feature of Northern Gothic art, whereas Ruskin and others point out that Roman art and Romanesque is based on the principle of symmetry, and to a considerable extent Greek art, but not entirely. And so the north is crooked, irregular, unfinished, and the south is well designed, regular. The streets are regular, and all centre on a plaza and so on. So that was a big contrast and a fascinating contrast of styles. When I looked at it in Japan, I thought, well, Japan is the extreme case and entirely different from the mainland. And I began to form this theory that feudal islands, like the British and the Japanese, had these irregular art systems, and big imperial political systems had much more symmetrical and top-down kinds of architecture. But in fact, the more I've learnt about Chinese art, the more I realise that it's actually got a huge amount of irregularity, unfinishedness in it. In fact, that's a central characteristic of, for instance, Chinese painting. It's very often alluding to things but not finished, and there are bits that aren't symmetrically matched at all. And the Chinese love that element of energy that comes from unresolved tensions and unfinished asymmetries. So it's a very important theme, and even in people's characters, those who are plain, straight, well organized are often less interesting than those who are filled with contradictions and confusions and start on things and don't finish them. And I have, I'm glad to say, a number of heroes and friends who are of that kind. So long live the crooked aspects of humanity.